Good afternoon to all of you. Nice to see you again. We come this time to session 39 of our Bible story entitled From Mark to Antioch. Well, last time I introduced you to a new literary phenomenon, the like of which, as far as we know, had never been written before. And I refer to the writing of the earliest gospel in the New Testament collection that is ascribed to an unknown Mark, and has the reputation of having been written in the city of Rome. This is such an important development in the Bible story that we need to stay with it for a while before moving on. When people pick up the Bible to start reading the New Testament for the first time, they inevitably start with the Gospels, partly because they're first in the index, but also because they tell the story of Jesus and are therefore easy to read. And after all, the whole of the New Testament begins with the story of Jesus, while the letters of Paul, which are placed following it, seem to be much more difficult to assimilate. And up to a point, that was the historical sequence. The story of Jesus' life, death and resurrection, followed by reflections on the meaning of it all. But the written Gospels we have did not come first. And the would-be scholar must tread very carefully in order not to be overwhelmed with confusion. Confusion, yes, because we can only begin to know the original events in the life of Jesus from the Gospels. So this is a tricky one. And until the 19th century, there had been no problem. The written Gospels were read as accurate historical books or even real biographies of Jesus. And many attempts were made during that century to write huge tomes, constructing and combining all four Gospels, explaining the life of Christ, and of course, giving full rein to the wildest flights of imagination. You can occasionally find one in a second-hand bookshop and indulge in the 19th century's attempts to shield the records of Jesus from the intensive questions of the scholars of the 18th century Enlightenment. European Enlightenment studies examined every bit of presumed knowledge and asked for evidence in every subject known to scholars. History was one of the first to be so examined, and every accepted statement of the past was subjected to rigorous searches for hard evidence. History as a subject is now very strictly defined and much more reliable than ever before. Then every other subject was put under scrutiny, and Christians were unable to stop skeptical scholars, especially in Germany, from applying their skeptical questions to the Bible itself. Consequently, Christian scholars had to join in and apply the same rigorous questions for themselves. And that has been our task throughout these last 39 sessions, going through the Bible story using the findings of reliable historians and archaeologists and discovering how the biblical writings gradually took their form within history. But intensive studies began with the Old Testament because there was a great feeling of reluctance about questioning the new, lest it seemed to be questioning and undermining the Son of God himself. So they could admit that not all Old Testament Psalms were written by David. That was okay, except they were then faced with the dilemma that Jesus hadn't questioned them when he sang them in the synagogue at Nazareth. But during the 20th century, there were several major critical studies made of the Gospels, each one accompanied by a conservative backlash, of course, but always endeavouring to find the real Jesus of history. The first thrust came from Rudolf Bultmann, a scholar of great renown, who served as a chaplain to the German soldiers of the First World War in the trenches. And he met battle-hardened soldiers who had no time for a gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Thank you very much. Bultmann quickly abandoned all the 19th century sentimentality about the Son of God and recognized the Gospels as the missionary books of the early church, promoting the triumph of the risen Christ, who was and always will be the cornerstone of Christian experience and witness. So he saw Mark's Gospel as early preaching in story form, to emphasize the significance of Jesus for the world in all time, while historical events just didn't matter to Bultmann. Next came form criticism, abandoning the bigger story, but then examining every little story or event as a separate sermon, with its own theological point to make. A valuable insight, but not enough on its own. Then there was redaction criticism, which I never really got to grips with, but later still literary criticism. Such has been the background to all I have learnt since the 1950s. I warned particularly to the literary critics who've emphasised the importance of the story in all the Bible has to offer. A good story, any good story, has a strong beginning, a strong end, and a crisis in the middle, which builds up to a dramatic climax. It has vividly drawn characters who are not all squeaky clean and perfect, but who draw the reader into the story to experience it for themselves. And as we saw last time, the unique Gospel of Mark exhibits all these characteristics. Do you remember that washing line image? I hope so. The word gospel means good news and was familiar to the early Christian missionaries, but it mainly had referred to the oral stories about Jesus, his passion, death, and resurrection in particular. The actions of Jesus and his teachings were of far less importance in their eyes. However, Mark's use of the word is very different. His opening statement was unique and new. The beginning of the gospel. Well, it now includes all of it, plus the reader's experience of the resurrection and their expectation of the imminent end of the world. Mark was certainly one of the greatest innovators of the Christian New Testament. New developments, however, hardly ever happen out of the blue. The bold claims of the missionaries, plus several stories to expand their claims, were well developed orally, but must have evoked some searching questions from those who listened. Why was the Messiah killed? What sort of person was he? The Jews among them knew why he behaved as he did, obeying the law, for example, and so did the Gentile proselytes. But in Rome, many Gentiles and slaves were being drawn in who had no knowledge at all of Jewish law. Why? What for? They asked. Now, hidden in chapter 10 of the Acts of the Apostles is an example of the original narrative oral story which circulated in the early years. It's placed in the mouth of Peter as he talked to the household of the Gentile Cornelius. Listen, this is from the Acts of the Apostles. And this is probably the earliest account of we have the missionaries' spiel about Jesus. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. You know the message he sent to the people of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ. Well, he is the Lord of all. And that message spread throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee, after the baptism that John announced. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, how he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. And we are witnesses of all he did, both in Judea and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree, but God raised him up on the third day and allowed him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who were chosen by God as witnesses, and who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach the gospel and to testify that he is the one ordained by God as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him, that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name." End of quote. Well, this early proclamation includes the beginning of the storyline, but there are no hints of it in any writings of Paul that we still have. After the disaster of 70 CE, the Gospel of Mark does seem to have been the first to set it all into writing. And again, we must ask why. Well, the original witnesses were gradually dying by then, either from persecution or the passage of time, and there was suddenly an urgent need to preserve what they had taught. Secondly, the Christians in Rome had already experienced persecution. So to hear of Jesus' sufferings, it was a great encouragement to them. And then thirdly, there was the danger that the original stories would gradually be exaggerated in the telling. So they needed a checklist to help prevent any misinterpretations of them. Well, before Mark's Gospel appeared, we had only what Paul's letters mentioned of the life of Jesus. Remember how little he told us? He'd been born of a woman. He was of royal descent. And then he gave us a reminder of what Jesus had taught at the Last Supper before his sufferings began. Mark has given us so much more. He put all the story memories into a shape and thus curtailed all the later excesses that grew in the many apocryphal Gospels of later years. Not only that, but he put his own intriguing stamp on the way his story unfolded. And scholars describe this stamp as Mark's messianic secret. Mark draws the reader straight away into the answer of the secret, who was Jesus, in his opening verse. Remember, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And then he tells the story of how the disciples and others failed time and time again in Galilee to recognize his true identity, in spite of all the clues they were given: healings, exorcisms, the stilling of the storm on the lake, the raising of Jairus' daughter from the dead, and the feeding of the 5,000 people. Readers can share Jesus' frustrations with the disciples until he had to force the issue during the important week they spent in isolation near Caesarea Philippi. There are two stories included of healing blind people, each placed in a strategic position. The one before Caesarea Philippi opened the eyes of the disciples, and the other as they all set off for that final showdown in Jerusalem, open the eyes of all who will come. And if birth stories were beginning to circulate, as they did around all important people, Mark's Jesus had no need of them. But the gospel does end with the first mention of an empty tomb, even though there's only the promise of future appearances. Well, I've given you a reasonably up-to-date assessment of this gospel as suggested by modern-day scholars. My own highly respected teacher is Professor David Catchpole, now retired, who claims that Mark's Gospel is a highly Christological document. despite its seemingly ingenuous storytelling. That each sentence is deliberately phrased, gradually building up to the crisis at Caesarea Philippi, and then again to the climax in Jerusalem, each time preceded by a low time among the disciples. First, asking the question, can you still not understand? And then in Jerusalem, when deserted at his arrest, and then denied by Peter of all people. These lows essentially enhance the highs, which followed by the exaggerated close contrast. All this now elevates Mark's Gospel to a place of great honour, in spite of how it had been viewed for much of Christian history. It had been overlooked for years, partly because it's the shortest of the four, and the other Gospels have so much more to tell. But noticeably, it is read less often than the others in the church's lectionaries. Mark's Gospel was thought of as stark, unlike the others. And worst of all, it only survived in the New Testament collection because it had come from Rome, the capital city of the church, as well as the empire. But once it was written, many copies would have been made and distributed around the empire. Let's look at the map. I hope you can make it out. Jerusalem in the bottom right-hand corner, which disappeared in 70. There's Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean. Then the Greek city of Ephesus became a great centre, and the Turkish one, and the Greek one at Corinth, and then, of course, Rome in Italy. Copies of the Gospel would have travelled along the trade routes, as always, and throughout those major centres of Christianity. The travelling apostles, now think of the word apostle. In the middle, you've got 4 letters, P-O-S-T. They were the postmen. They took the Gospel around. They really did become the church's postmen. We really do not know how Mark's Gospel was received and used around the empire, with the exception of one place, and that was Antioch in Syria. So let's imagine what went on there. Do you remember Antioch in Syria? It was a town on the banks of the river Orontes, very close to the coast of the northern Mediterranean, a great trading city. So it had attracted a lot of Jews who went there to trade along with others. It was a Greek trading city to start with, and as such had a sizable community of Jews who lived according to their own customs and laws and worshipped their own monotheistic God. But their synagogue also attracted Gentiles who became proselytes, impressed by their monotheism. They became almost full members, except for circumcision. But when the gospel arrived, many had been baptized and become a sizable community to the extent that it was in Antioch that the nickname Christian was first used to describe them. Some went to Jerusalem in the early days, and in Acts chapter 6 records that Nicholas from Antioch was one of the 7 deacons appointed to help with all the admin work, to relieve the apostles and enable them to concentrate on the preaching. It was in Antioch that the big decision was made that baptism, not circumcision, should be the doorway into the Christian community. Well, alarm bells began to ring in Jerusalem about the liberties being taken in Antioch. So the leaders there in Jerusalem sent Barnabas to investigate. And their report is in Acts chapter 11, verses 19 to 29. Because while Barnabas was in Antioch, he had sent for Saul of Tarsus to come and join them. And together they spent a whole year in Antioch. Before the church in Antioch laid hands on them, Barnabas and Saul, and commissioned the first missionary journey to Cyprus and Asia Minor, before they even returned to Jerusalem. Such was the Christian community in Antioch, authentic, authoritative, able to make its own decisions. But much later, when Saul, now named Paul, revisited the Christians in Antioch, he found the situation which aroused his great anger, which is all for all to read in his letter to the Galatians. He found a disturbing situation there in the behavior of Peter, who was also visiting Antioch. Peter had been persuaded by zealous Jews coming from Jerusalem to remember that Jews don't eat with Gentiles. And they persuaded Peter to remove himself from eating with the other Christians who were Gentiles. Paul took him to task, but lost. Peter's strict Jewishness won the day, and Paul left, never to go again, apart from one brief stopover years later on his last journey to Jerusalem. Paul continued to muse on the dilemma, and he wrote that Christ had broken the chains of the law by dying on a tree and being raised by God. But if now the chains of the law, circumcision, were to be reinstated, he wrote bluntly, then Christ died for nothing. Well, the church in Antioch, even before the disaster of 70 CE, had become second in importance to that in Jerusalem, a faith movement rather than a political one. It was well organized. It had a committee that worked with an authority of its own. They already noticed they took the initiative to send out their own missionaries after laying hands on them in prayer. But after 70, the church in Antioch was free, and it developed even more successfully. They had plenty of officials. There were elders, there was a secretary, a treasurer, a chairman, who is called the episkopos, or in English, the bishop. He was assisted by a group of presbyters who shared the leadership in the weekly Eucharists. And there was also a group of deacons, who included the treasurer, whose responsibilities were to the congregations, knowing who was poverty-stricken among them and in need of financial help, or who was ill, and likewise of need of help as well as prayer, and so on. The church in Antioch was also influential in communicating with other Christian centres, possibly even receiving copies of Paul's letters, which were being collected together and shared. Antioch had lost touch with Paul, but his letters, no doubt, gave them food for thought. And then, soon after 70, possibly as early as 78 or 79, just at the disastrous time when the non-Christian Jews were expelled when the non-Christian Jews expelled all Christians from their synagogues, another document arrived, a brand new gospel from Rome. Excitement, yes, but soon it turned to disappointment. Disappointing concern, because in spite of all its innovation and creation of the story, the Jewish Christians in Antioch knew Mark's gospel just wasn't good enough. It wasn't Jewish enough. It portrayed Jesus as a Jew acceptable in Rome amongst Gentiles, but not among Jews in Antioch. Wonderful idea it was, certainly, but it was wrong, or rather, it wasn't right. It wasn't the story of the Messiah God had promised the Jews, so something had to be done. They decided that they themselves had to write a better gospel. So possibly discussion groups came into being, working on the idea. But in the end, it was one secretary. Was his name Matthew? Or was that a pseudonym to give it credibility with the name of the tax gatherer who'd been one of the disciples? We don't know. We do know one person wrote the whole document, giving it its own unique style. And we have an icon of Matthew with his gospel. And there's also another picture from the Lindisfarne Gospels, which I like so much, again with Matthew busy writing. Matthew's Gospel started with the story outline that Mark had established, but soon deviated to present Jesus and his ministry as a second Moses, much more Jewish. They devised 5 big sections, each with a collection of little stories, as in Mark, but including others, and with a long section of Jesus' teaching attached to each collection. And each of the 5 sections were written as if they were the 5 new books of the Pentateuch. Very Jewish idea. Then a very Jewish introduction was added, with an almost typical genealogy of Jesus, proving his royal descent from King David and the Jewish ancestor Abraham. I said almost, because this one unusually includes 4 women, 3 of whom are of very doubtful reputation, plus Mary. Why? Well, it seems to reflect the current anger between the Jews in the synagogues and the expelled Jewish Christians, with accusations coming from the synagogue Jews that Jesus' parentage was of very doubtful legitimacy. The Christian response was, so what? It enhanced the idea that Jesus was physically fathered by the Holy Spirit, and therefore indeed God's Messiah. Then the Gospel gives its readers a collection of birth stories to assert his importance as of old in the ancient world. Compare the birth stories of Moses and Samson, the prophet Samuel that we've covered in past sessions, with all the details culled from the Old Testament, apart from the story of the Magi, to acknowledge that Gentiles also came to worship the Jewish Messiah as forecast by the great prophet, 2nd Isaiah. At its end, Matthew's Gospel gives more information of the immediate resurrection appearance of Jesus and includes a story to counteract another accusation coming from the synagogue Jews that the Christians had themselves stolen and hidden the body of Jesus in order to claim that Jesus had been mysteriously raised to new life. The Gospel refutes this with a counter-accusation that it was the Jewish priests, no less, who bribed the soldiers with a large sum of money to say all this. But the Gospel ends on a note of triumph with the Grand Commission to all Jesus' disciples, all Jews of course, at his ascension and last appearance, to go and make disciples of all the nations, thus fulfilling the vision of the prophet of 2nd Isaiah, that all nations would eventually be drawn in to worship their God Yahweh. Sadly, nowadays, the anti-Jewish polemic we have noted as a response of its time included the questionable 23rd chapter, which was written as if its accusations had originally been said by Jesus himself. It's become embedded as the gospel of the church worldwide, and we have humbly to admit that it has been largely responsible for the anti-Semitism that has since appeared throughout history. Next time, we shall stay with this gospel. It's so important that we need to follow it again with more developments of the influential church in Antioch in Syria. And that will be in 2 weeks' time, on Sunday the 15th of October, again at 4:30. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.